Hello, welcome to Intimate Discourse. My name's Jason. This episode, The Scarlet Letter, was recorded in Toronto on March 20th, 2022. We want to thank you for listening and really hope that you enjoy the show. In this episode, we want to take you through our COVID-19 vaccine decision path. We'd like to illustrate the timeline of events and expose what types of data were influencing our choices. One of the frustrations I've had during this whole experience is being unable to clearly express myself on the spot, particularly when speaking with someone who has already had their presumptions kicked into overdrive upon hearing that I didn't intend to get the vaccine. In my experience, in this day and age, when two people find each other on opposite sides of an argument who have been exposed to different and sometimes contradictory information, there is no predisposition to hear the other person out. Rather, the one ostensibly listening will guffaw, smirk, and otherwise silently judge after already tuning out most of what the other person is saying and begin formulating their own responses in their heads based mostly off a stereotypical summation of what they assume the other person's position to be, not necessarily what their position actually is. So if I've made a choice not to get the vaccine, a plethora of other traits will have also been assigned to me by the person with whom I'm speaking. By virtue of my decision not to get the vaccine, I must subsequently also be selfish, right-wing, a conspiracy theorist, a Trump supporter, and possibly even a flat earther. It matters very little what I say when attempting to delineate my position, because no one who believes that the earth is flat should be taken seriously anyway. Which I don't, by the way, and for the record. And so the conversation, which has now rapidly evolved into a confrontation, unravels as predictably as you could imagine. Backs are up, platitudes are issued, and feelings of resentment and frustration fester and pop in little passive-aggressive outbursts. I truly think that the long-form podcast format is one of the last vestiges of a civilized democratic society. It allows the podcaster to fully express their ideas and engage with others on a level that is lost in many other forms of communication. Yes, the ideas only flow one way, at least during the podcast itself, but there is no immediate form of rebuttal for those that have committed to listen. You're forced to listen to the whole story. Sure, you could always flip to something else or even just tune me out while you spin on your Peloton and dream of sun-kissed beaches and tiki huts, while my words drift helplessly through your ear canal and auditory cortex before being jettisoned out of your brain with all the other incidental stimuli. But at the very least, ego has been removed from the equation. If you're someone who is opposed to these nefarious anti-vaxxers, you won't feel the immediate, almost compulsive need to tell me how I'm wrong. Now, I expect that most of you will have already embarked upon your own journey down the COVID vaccine rabbit hole, because in the world of ideas, so often like tends to attract like. But for those of you that are listening to this who aren't predisposed to sympathize with our arguments, whether you're still on the fence about some stuff, or whether you're listening to this despite every fiber of your being screaming to you that it's all fake news, we sincerely thank you for your time and salute you. Challenging your own beliefs, especially when they've been reinforced by a heady media, always eager to pit one segment of society against the other, isn't as easy as it looks. In fact, I would suspect that by doing this, you're doing something that the majority of people don't do or do only very rarely, or after some cataclysmic awakening. After listening to us, you may remain unconvinced. Your mileage may vary, and you may be quite all right with that. What we're trying to do is simply show our side. We want to explain how we made the decision we made, not because of a lack of adherence to science, but rather the opposite, because we were following the very principles on which the scientific method was based. We used data, logic, and analysis to form our opinions, and we never tried to tell anyone else what they should do either, for the record. And with that, I would just like to say welcome to the show. My name is Jason, and I'm here with Dimitri. How are you doing today, Dimitri?
Hello, folks. Doing really well. Great to be here.
So let's get started. I want to go through talking about really like a timeline of events almost, just to sort of sum everything up. This is March 2022.
Believe it or not.
Yeah, I can't. It's the future. At a bit of a crossroads as to where to begin this, I think the best way to do this is just to launch right into the beginning of the pandemic. Those early days when we started seeing the reports coming in from Asia that the numbers were up and what is this new thing and could it come to our shores? I think maybe just because who knows when people will be listening to this, we might want to just kind of do a recap and sort of paint a picture.
Sure.
I remember in early 2020, I went down to right around the beginning when it was all starting. I think it was maybe January, February. And I had a sick relative in Sacramento, and I went down and visited for a week, and he passed away while I was there, actually. And it was, coming back, going into the airport on the way back, it was a pretty harsh trip. But I remember somebody coughing sort of effusively in the waiting area. And I was just like, my God, I hope this person isn't on my plane.
Yeah.
But I think there had been maybe a few cases that had sort of percolated through to the, Western countries. But it was really top of mind for me. I had been following it since the beginning. Like, I'm a big... when there's something, any kind of apocalyptic situation, I'm always on top of.
Yeah.
But I remember thinking at the beginning, like, I want to get back to Canada and just to kind of like hunker down almost. Like, I don't want to like be in an airport basically. That was really, I think, the last time I have traveled anywhere since, out of the country since then. So that was my beginning. And, I remember even here in Toronto, there was a point where, I stopped. I used to take the TTC to work, and I stopped, I think, as soon as the first couple of cases were in Toronto. And, I think a lot of people called me crazy. And I was like, you know what, like, I don't know what this is. And it's just a risk thing, it's a risk analysis of it. Where were you in that? Like, do you remember that?
Very, very similar. Like, again, playing the long game and being early on a lot of these things. Initially, it's probably around end of February, I started wearing gloves when I was pumping gas or going to the grocery store and whatnot. And you'd see the occasional other person cashing out wearing gloves. And it's like, oh, there's some other people like me here. I'm not the only one. Some people is almost, in terms of like signaling your tribe, you're like, look, like-minded people, And you saw it sort of percolating through society slowly. And I was very quick. I had a lot of disposable latex gloves around anyways, just to do the nature of my work, and it was a very easy entry level. And, it seemed to be more touch oriented than respiratory at the time anyway. So you were just like super, super careful very early on. And the story just kept evolving. And I was definitely watching globally what was happening, in countries from Japan right through to the Middle East, Israel, the UK, Sweden. And then, eventually us. We really were kind of like the last chapter, really, that it kind of swept the tsunami of this whole story over us much, much later than other places. So I was just trying to stay ahead of the curve and be really, really safe around my loved ones, around clients, around anyone I interacted with. And probably pretty quick on when you would see people walking outside, standing too close to one another, you just kind of look at them and you're like, oh, that's a little dangerous. I don't know about that. Yeah, this is a little crazy. There's something going on here, guys. And just like I entered the story early, I probably also exited the story a little early too. So that's just my default setting towards things. Right. So yeah, very much like you, just very aware, very cautious, aware of my surroundings and the news and the virology and the emerging data. And just being careful in all situations.
Yeah, and at the risk of sounding like we're tooting our own horns, I mean, how do you, like, there are plenty of things I'm, don't know about or whatever. This just happened to be something I took an interest in because I really like the movie 12 Monkeys. And there was a lot of that kind of thing. I actually thought it would be hilarious if some 12 Monkeys people graffitied around Toronto, but alas, no one did.
Well, a lot of times, like, these things do start somewhere and a lot of stories will happen and they just kind of peter out. And you're like, oh, I guess it never happened here. Yeah. And more times than not, they peter out. And but I just kind of sat back and I had the funny vibe, just the flow of information on the news, the headlines and everything. I'm like, I don't think this is going to be slowing down. I think it's actually going to be ramping up.
Well, when it hit Italy, I think that was sort of the ramifications of that kind of hit home for a lot of people.
And then at that time too, we were talking about the direct link. Well, there was a fashion week there a week before and they had buyers from all around the world, coming in and congregating and now spreading back to, taking the virus elsewhere, trying to figure this out step by step, which made, shutting down the airports early really important too, because okay, so the easiest way to stop it from coming in is to stop anybody from coming in. But alas, it got in.
Yeah, and it got in probably despite any, it was inevitable that it would have come in. I remember at the time being quite frustrated that the Trudeau government didn't shut the airports down sooner, because
sure.
I thought that was, and I think New Zealand did, if I have my facts right. Like I think they were pretty quick on the ball.
And
with
you
it.
had politics immediately, like, oh, it's politically incorrect and it'll be deemed racist if you're stopping certain people from, like, why does a virus care about your race? It's coming from a lot of planet place A and it's landing in place B. Like, that's all it is. Certainly if it started in Toronto, the virus, I would fully expect other people to not let planes from Toronto land. Absolutely no problem.
Yeah.
So.
That's a little crazy. The whole race card early on. I remember, was it Pelosi who went to Chinatown and sort of declared, like everybody should be here, or whatever she said. And it's kind of like, well, I mean, like that's great.
Politics started right away.
Yeah, it's true.
It was like, it's not about politics, it's about a virus. Yet immediately it was all about politics. Well, not all about, but there was a ton of politics involved. Yeah,
it was. And I mean, that was at the height of, the sort of Trump versus the media thing. Yeah. So there was a lot of, the daily impeachment threats, everything like that. And you remember the nursing homes, how that was a big thing. I remember my grandmother died, well, fairly recent, like a few years before this started. But I just remember thinking, she was in a nursing home and like near the end, and it was like, I couldn't even imagine. Like, it would be like, the people who had to go through that, where they had relatives in nursing homes, and obviously the people who were in the nursing homes, it's like, what a horrible way to go. And like what, as you've got this unknown disease and nobody really knows what they're doing, and it's rippling through, elderly people, like right away. You could see that, especially in Italy. And, you're really helpless against, you can't sit with them at the end even.
Helpless for sure. But at the same time, the cracks started, in terms of our response, showing immediately. Like, really, if you shut down airplanes right away, you're going to maybe be able to 2 weeks flatten the curve, because you're just stopping all the, a large amount of the transmission into your country. And that's what I think what got everybody on board.
Yeah.
And then, of course, within those 2 weeks, it still got in the country and percolated, and we're all closed here in Canada at least 90 days or whatever. But and then you heard about the response in terms of retirement homes, and you could see early on, because a lot of people debate this, well, in the early days, we didn't really know what was happening. But even in Italy, in the north, when people were dying, they used to say a village a day, the age skewing, the risk stratification was really towards the elderly. Mm-hmm. So then you don't know much about this, but you're like, okay, that's interesting. Let's see where this goes. But thank goodness it's not affecting children to the same rate as those who've had a full life already. And and then when it came to our response here in Canada, you saw that people were being diagnosed, maybe hospitalized or whatever, but they were sent back to the retirement homes and long-term care homes. You're literally bringing the virus back into the place of which people are the weakest.
Right.
And we talk about quarantine hotels and separating those who can't be separated from physical distancing. That would have been the perfect moment for something like that to have been initiated.
Yeah. And, hindsight 2020 and everything. I do think that, that was something, at least it's almost like if we get the same thing happen again, that would be one of the steps. I would hope that, I don't even know if that would be, in my mind, that would be something, that they would want to change next time around, where it's like immediately sort of protect the people that are the most at risk. Everything else, like have your rules or whatever that you want to impose, but make that be a separate thing and mostly focus on the people who are most at risk.
This is still my concern, though, and I don't know if we've learned those lessons.
Right.
There was sort of one size fits all blanket approach seems to permeate through most of what's going on. When you get into that line of thinking, you drift more towards the Swedish model or the Great Barrington Declaration, focused protection, targeted, move heaven and earth to save the elderly.
Yeah.
I still don't really hear that for the most part coming from our officials.
Right.
So I don't know if we were to drift back into that today, if we would actually change our approach, unfortunately.
Yeah, like with so much of this, it isn't even... you really do wonder what we've learned. We've learned about the virus to some extent, but in our response to it and how we as a society sort of responded to it and responded to the subsequent, laws or, suggestions. I don't think we've learned. I think it's we are still sort of in a state of almost like paranoia, tribal paranoia, and that in itself has been quite politicized as well, or polarized at the very least.
Yeah, I would agree with you.
So you had masks, the sort of we came with that social distancing. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
still paint the picture. So you had social distancing suggestions, and then implementations at grocery stores and everything like that. You stand in line in No Frills or wherever your grocery store of choice for a while. And I remember even going in the first time into a No Frills after this and thinking like, this is great. Like, I waited in line, but like I hated going into crowded grocery stores.
Yeah.
And now it's like you have all this like space around you. It's quite nice. And I remember thinking like, this is how it should always have been. Like, this should be how society is.
But then I was getting maybe a little Puritan in the early days, because I'm like, this is a virus. People are dying. Like, my God, you have to do maximum amount to try to like save life. But you would see people waiting in line, and this was before masking was really in effect, and they would be outside of the LCBO. And then, posting on Facebook, mama still needs her wine sort of thing, right? Like, really? You need a bottle of wine so bad you're going to risk a contagion for?
Right.
So you would see like, for me, like still people not taking it seriously enough and trying to get on with their life in such a normal, what I would think like almost like a secondary, like obviously that's not an essential good for most people, having their alcohol.
Well, speak for yourself.
Yeah. And so that kind of stuff was like irking me early on. Because like, guys, this is a disease, and it looks like we're shutting down the planet, and businesses have been closed, and you're willing to stand in line for something that's really not all that essential for most people. I found the variance in what people decided, like their risk cost benefit analysis, wildly different,
That's interesting because, very early on, I was taking precautions. Like, I wasn't taking the TTC, but it was early on that I was looking at the stats where I was like, okay, like, you still have a pretty good chance of not dying from this. Like, you didn't know about long COVID or anything like that at that point, but I thought, what, I have probably an overweening confidence in my own immune system. Like, I'll be proven wrong for sure at some point. Like, it's just like
but
hubris can only, but not yet.
Yeah.
But I do feel like I feel like, what, I never get the flu vaccine. This is one of my reasons for, I didn't want to get the vaccine, where it's like, I've never gotten the flu vaccine, or at least if I did, it was like, decades ago before I was making informed choices. And there's no real reason that I haven't been other than just thinking I don't feel like I need it. And I see people getting the flu vaccine and they still kind of get sick. And it's like, I know that there's different variants, and I'm not, it's not that I don't like get it. Like, I get why people would want to get the vaccine. I just don't think it works for me. And I would rather it's like, I'll tell you what, like 1 year, maybe I'll get the flu and then I'll change my mind, but I haven't. So like, why would I change something that seems to be working for decades now? But
I do catch the flu quite often, but I just accept it and just go through it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but when this thing came around, I was like, okay, so it's a bad flu, a really bad flu for some people. But for my part, I was like, I'm still going to go to the liquor store. Like, this is not a necessity, but it's I mean, it's hard. How else do you get through this thing without liquor? It's like almost unimaginable.
Well, that to your point, everybody had a different anxiety level, a different lifestyle, different living arrangements.
Yeah.
So again, I was probably approaching it from too much of a strict Puritan point of view early on. Like, my God, this is literally like DEFCON 5 now in the virology world. Yeah. And, I definitely within 30 days could see that different people had different needs, and that we had to approach this. I've been, to reformulate my thinking, you had to approach this in a much more personalized way, and just sort of, like let people live to a large degree how they're used to living and how they need to live.
Yeah.
And that my judgment was unfounded, and really I should just be looking at myself and doing what I need to do to be safe and my immediate loved ones.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And sort of consistent with what I think about a lot of things, where it's like, everybody make their own decisions, be informed, don't be informed, like, but don't tread on me kind of thing. We really, getting into, I think it was late 2020. I remember there being a big fervor about the vaccines coming out, and like we have to hurry up and produce these, and when I first heard about this, I was like, yeah, good. Like, let's get the vaccines out. Let's whatever. I at the time didn't know much about how long it generally takes to test these things or whatever. I just thought, okay, it's going to be rushed for sure. But this is a pandemic, so focus your energies, drug companies, and do your thing.
I completely agree. When I heard like it takes normally 7 to 10 years to create a vaccine, I was like, wow, really? I had no idea.
I know, yeah,
6 months, 9 months. I had no clue. It's not my specialty. Wasn't following the scene at all. So and I never had the EBGBs like this was a rushed product. I'm like, let the scientists do what scientists do, and if this is the right solution, let's apply it.
Yeah. And I did. That really is when you think about it, because they came out near the end of 2020, didn't they?
Yep.
I mean, that was that's less than a year.
I believe Israel took their first doses December 19th, 2020.
Yeah. I mean, that's incredible, incredibly fast. So yeah, they came out, and I remember when they were starting to roll out, and there was this big kind of, I don't want to say narrative because it sort of implies some sort of, conspiratorial purpose or something. But there really seemed to be this push in the media. Almost the story was like, thank God the vaccines are getting out. Hope we have enough for everybody. Almost pushing this like, obviously you'd want it. So, let's like washing over the fact that some people might be, well, hey, wait a minute, what is this again? That was never really, vaccine skepticism never seemed to be any kind of a thread in the mainstream media throughout when these things were being rolled out. It was like it's assumed you want it,
And a lot of momentum behind it, and you're right. And within a couple of weeks, I think at the first cracks started to show where people are like, well, is it necessary for everyone?
Right.
Let's look at the skewing and the risk stratification here. Maybe I'm not quite so sure yet. Can I get it in a year from now?
Right.
They seem to be quite quickly. The wiggle room was going to get a lot tighter and tighter and tighter.
Yeah.
On this, which has never happened in pop modern culture. You know what I mean?
And it was an interesting, early on I thought to myself, and this is, you could argue a little selfish, but I thought to myself, yeah, like I'm not going to get it. I'll get everybody else will get it, and I'll have herd immunity, and I'll be fine.
Well, and that works since you're not really, as you probably knew at that time, not center focused in terms, you were much more in the peripheral of, will I actually get hurt severely by this disease?
Right.
If you're at ground zero, then you might have a different analysis, you know? So you had the luxury of not just knowing that other people who are more, obviously with demographics, there's so many more older people today than ever before. So if they all kind of go, they, by definition, will create that circle of immunity around you.
Right.
And since you're not part of the bullseye target zone of those who are getting sick, you had every right to kind of step to the side and let those who are most vulnerable go first.
Right.
Get it because they need it most, and then just take a wait and see approach. You had the luxury of youth and health.
Yeah, and bless you with the youth comments, sir. I mean, but
it's all relative.
Yeah, it's all relative. I remember, I sort of encouraging my parents to get their shot because they were going to get it anyway, and they're a little older, so it's like, it made sense for them to get it. And just continuing to watch, the politicization of the rollout and and I remember there being some shortages and did we overorder a bunch of vaccines? Because of course you dispose of them after X number of weeks or whatever. So I don't know, it was mid 2021 rolls around, and I still hadn't had the vaccine, and you hadn't had the vaccine.
No, yeah.
And what were the responses that you were getting as that year rolled on, if you can remember?
Well, my situation was interesting because our business was closed from November 2020 till July 1st, 2021. And again, we were taking it very seriously. So we were not interacting with hardly anyone, just my wife and I in my house, and occasionally taking a walk with my parents outside, and the odd coffee in the garage of lots of air ventilation, but not even stepping inside their house and nobody coming inside our house. So we were like the definition of cocooning and hunkering down. And we were researching, we were researching different doctors from around the world, different medical associations around the world, different countries and their responses. And we saw around the time when it was available for our age group in Canada, me being in the 40 to 49 bracket, it really was like mid-June around that time. And Israel had been double vaxxed at that point. and they were starting to see an uptick in cases, which were resulting in an uptick in hospitalizations. And they had started maybe we should have to give a third shot for those who are 65 and older. So that sort of information and knowledge, which wasn't really being conveyed on mainstream legacy media, made my wife and I just sort of pause and say, well, we have the benefit of very low numbers in the summertime, because just through natural fluctuations, it's going to drop. And our business, by definition, will be shut down if the numbers ever go higher. So we said we are in a very peculiar situation where we get shut down when we get 700 cases in a province of 17 million. Mm-hmm. That was the threshold to shut down our business. So the chances of actually bumping into the virus were low, and it was summertime as well. And as the story kept emerging, the more and more data that was coming through only created the barrier in which to get the vaccine to increase in size.
Yeah,
I was very, very, very close to getting it many times. Online. Oh, look, honey, it's just down the road. We can get AstraZeneca. It's 11:30 at a Shoppers Drug Mart. We'll go there and be finished in 20 minutes. That's fantastic. Like, I'm very sympathetic to everybody in this because, I could have just by a flip of a coin have gone and got it as well. But as more and more data, so be it, came through, we're like, well, we have the benefit of time, and I'm going to play the long game, because if I get vaccinated and regret it, I can never get unvaccinated. That's a short-term game for a very potentially long-term loss.
Right.
So if I want to play the long-term game, I'm going to sit back and just wait for more data to come through, because once I do this, I can't undo it.
Yeah.
So that's where I was at.
So let's actually take a look at some of that data, because I think that a lot of the skepticism against people who were, I'm sure there's got to be a better, what's the euphemism for an anti-vaxxer? Like, there's got to be a better term to call people that
vaccine hesitant,
vaccine hesitant. Yeah,
neutral,
there you go. Yeah. Okay. So the let's take a look at some of these stats, and because I think there's a lot of people have this idea, like one of the sort of criticisms about the vaccine hesitant is, well, what are you thinking? You're going against the advice of the top medical experts in the country and in the world. Like, everybody's, seemingly everybody at the top brass is saying, hey, get the vaccines, your best protection. Mm-hmm. So the argument would be, to the vaccine hesitant, what gives you the right to think that somehow you know better than these people? Because by definition, if you're not getting the vaccine and they're saying you should, you're being a contrarian. So let's take a look at some of the stats. Like, first of all, I guess, how would you respond to that? Somebody says that to you. I'm sure you've had like that say that to you a lot of the time. Yeah, no, to say to you, everybody else, all the experts are saying that you should get this vaccine. Mm-hmm. Why are you not getting it?
True. Well, first of all, you have to define an expert, because there's experts. An expert who goes with the consensus is no more an expert who doesn't go with the consensus. So it's a funny situation we find ourselves in today, because you can find a person who's a 25-year illustrious career in virology, but if they decide to go against the consensus, all of a sudden they're a rogue non-expert.
Right.
So via the internet and podcasts and just researching in general, you saw that there was actually, as there should be in a scientific community, a lot of contrary opinions on what is the best route to take. It was around that time that I actually bumped into that great Barrington Declaration, which was all about focused protection and vaccinating, pro-vax, everybody who truly needs this. And needs this in terms of severe hospitalization, severe illness and hospitalizations. There was no talk early on that this was going to stop the spread. This is all about, you get this vaccine, you're not going to end up in the hospital. So when you contrast that expert opinion against the messaging we were getting from our own local governments, it's not any different than wanting to go get a hip surgery and someone says you need to get your hip replaced, and you go to get a second opinion from an expert and they say, well, maybe therapy might be the right way through this. I don't know where we lost the ability to have a second opinion from qualified experts. And if you dug deep enough and turned off your television set, you saw there was quite a bit of different diverging opinions on how to handle the situation. And then it didn't take much to somebody who's vaccine hesitant. You say, well, what age group are you in? And if they said 65 and older and I have type 1 diabetes, you might want to say, well, actually, cost benefit analysis skews towards you getting the vaccine. You're certainly somebody who would be probably better off taking this. But when you would scroll down, and most countries and municipalities had their own data on these things. Oh, look at that. I fall between 40 and 49. And even now, at 2 years into this, in my particular age bracket, 40 to 49, it's only 200 and so deaths in all of Ontario, which is 17 million people.
200 or so deaths in that age range?
Yes. So that's the age range that I specifically fall in. So
that
now
still sounds like a lot, though. 200 deaths from between 40 and 49 in Ontario.
Yeah, over a 2-year period.
Right.
And
is that just in general or COVID-related deaths?
COVID-related.
Okay.
And then we have to get into the incidental with COVID or from COVID. And who are these 200 people? Were they malnourished? Did they have drug problems? Did they have diabetes, underlying health conditions?
Right.
So, but even if you take 200 as gospel, 200 deaths over a 2-year period isn't enough for me to say anything needs to be mandated. It's a personal choice. And by all means, you should be able to trust your own medical associations. And if they say this is the right solution for your health problem, you have, of course, on my point of view, 100% support to go do that. But I didn't see enough to say you must do this. So depending on who the person was, if they are vaccine hesitant, it would depend on their living arrangements, personal health, just like everything. Consult your doctor to see if this medication is right for you. The one-size-fits-all mentality that seemed to emerge early on never seemed to fit any of the data that was coming through.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments I would give to the how do you know better than the experts is simply, they have their mandate, and from their perspective, trying to, take care of a whole population of people. Like the simplest course is, everybody gets the vaccine. We'll lose less people that way than we will the other way.
Sure.
So okay, sure, that's their thing, but you have to think as an individual. You're not, we're coming from a different, well, it's like the argument, like, you talk to your doctor's going to know you a lot better than, the CEO or the head of the CDC or the head of Canada Health. So it's the granularity of having, I feel like I know my own body more. I feel like my doctor knows it a little less, but is more knowledgeable about medicine. And then it gets abstracted to a point where it's like, the policies are so broad that it's like, it doesn't fit into what I believe.
You certainly, we do. It does hit that crux where is it an individual solution versus a population level based solution?
Right.
And again, I'm very sympathetic to the population level solution because you have to almost do a lowest common denominator, what's going to get society through this. But to then tell a healthy 25-year-old, you must do this or you can't go to school,
right,
doesn't really seem to help society much. It doesn't seem to definitely help the individual much, at least not enough to say it must be mandated.
Right.
And that's the issue when you get into central planning. Like it just becomes the big idea is far more important than any nuanced truths that may come out in the meantime.
Right.
And so in order for the big idea to be the overarching goal of society, certain truths have to be almost cast by the wayside.
Yeah. And I think again, it's like if this had been something that, because let's go over the statistics for. I mean, these are the statistics that we were looking at, in sort of early mid 2021, in terms of making a decision whether we wanted to get the vaccine or not, and. The stuff more than I do in terms of the actual. I would always hear things anecdotally, but my memory is as porous as a pasta sieve. So like I can't, I never have the figures at hand, but I remember it being over 99% survival rate for the average person. Am I wrong in that?
No, not at all. And actually, the more testing we did, the higher the survival rate became. Because just by definition, there was so many people that were not being tested and surviving it. So the more testing you do, the survival rate only increased and increased and increased and increased. You can actually see the same thing was true for SARS-CoV-1.
So the more testing you do, in the sense that, like, as time goes on, more people are going to have it and not be tested. So if you can only do X number of tests and that number is low initially. There are going to be, by definition, many people who don't know they have it, are in society, had it, survived it, Oh, I see.
and weren't counted as part of your stats.
Right. So the people who did have it and didn't survive it, that would be known. Whereas that would be an unknown if it was the opposite.
So the more testing you have, the more the survival rate goes up.
Right.
And you're normally, not to try to quote a direct number on this, but you're going to find, depending on the age bracket and country and underlying, there's so many different variables here. We're into something of a 99.5. Insert the next number, it's usually another 7, 8, 9 at that point, survival rate.
Yeah.
And certainly as you dip lower and you get into the under 18 crowd, you're somewhere in the realm of 99.99825 or something.
Yeah, you start getting into the Amazon AWS uptime kind of things.
Yes. And again, nothing to say it's worth mandating over. You wish it's there, we have a solution. Make your familial choice and go get it if that's the right thing for you.
Yeah.
But to mandate something over, I was talking to one lady who is from China and has been through these more centralized planning, and she's very happy to be in Canada. She took a much more extreme approach, and she said, well, unless 20% of the population's dying, I don't think the government should ever get involved. It's your choice. There's the hospital, and fix the hospitals. And your life is your life, and the hospital is the hospital life. And you do what is necessary for you. And although that isn't, I can see where she's delineating, like you do have a certain amount of personal responsibility in this, as the government has their responsibility. And to say all of a sudden now you must shut down your life entirely because the government and the hospitals weren't ready, only works for so long. In Ontario, we haven't really increased ICU capacity, and we're 2 years into this.
Right. Well, the argument could probably be made that we haven't because we're still dealing with the epidemic. There's only so much, if you're triaging and you're still dealing with people getting sick, then, and apparently a lot of the front care or frontline workers have all, apparently that's a sort of decimated population now as well, because not necessarily because they've all been wiped out with COVID, but a lot of them have just been like taking other jobs because it's like, well, this is too stressful, or like forced out or whatever because of mask mandates. But I don't know how big that how big of a percent that is, but it's so I could sort of be sympathetic with let's wait till things calm down. We were unprepared for sure, and we can get into that, which I do think there's a story there too as to why we were unprepared. But and I do think it's like government mismanagement and like a lack of priority to the things that are important. But I would say that at this point, it's like, okay, now we've learned our lesson in that sense. So let's try to build better, let's try to build back better. Let's try and get the hospitals, more prepared for, in case this kind of thing happens again. But of course, you can't have, just playing devil's advocate. You can't have, you can't spend this huge budget just on preparing for a pandemic that might not come again for the next, 100 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
It's like having, a big snowplow division in a southern Mediterranean country. Right. At a certain point, the cost doesn't really justify. But I think the problem is a little more heady, a little more philosophical, a little more ideological, because these are sort of the practical implementations of what we need to do to stop this from happening. But if I may, I just want to read a quote by a very good independent journalist out of Quebec. And
is it in French?
If it would, we wouldn't be quoting it. Yeah, and he's fantastic, and he has a great website. His name is Julius Ruchel, and just give me a second to read through this because I think it's going to highlight the underlying root problems of what we've been struggling with on a society level. So the quote goes, "As always, big ideas that depend on a collective buy-in from the community are, by definition, threatened by anyone whose opinion, ideas, objective evidence, personal needs, or individual choices break the cohesiveness of the group. And so, inconvenient facts that must be suppressed, inconvenient opinions that must be silenced, inconvenient individuals must be canceled, and individual choices must be ruthlessly replaced with loyalty to the group in order to achieve the utopia waiting on the horizon. Truth is the first casualty of central planning. Intolerance isn't a bug in central planned societies, it's a feature."
Yeah,
and so this is where I come back now to central planning in the hospitals. Maybe it is a time for privatization to a degree. Maybe that would have laid off some of the, created more efficiencies and competition within the market. If during this pandemic, all the private hospitals were able to hire the people you're requesting and increase the size of the ICUs, we have now a very good, almost like a randomized control trial of sense, like which of the two operating systems are actually going to perform better under pressure.
Right.
And there was a moment in time, and they've taken it off the Ontario's website, where if you scroll down on the part where they had ICU capacity early on, and you clicked and said, instead of 30 days, 90 days, all time, for the first 6 months, the capacity of Ontario's ICUs was 3,500 beds. Oh, wow. Then 6 months in, starting in about the fall of 2020, it drops down to 2,500, 1,000 less, and stays there oscillating up and down a bit to where we are now in early 2022. So we actually have 1,000 less ICU beds now than from the very start of the pandemic. Now, you could argue, I don't know what the nature of these ICU beds are. Were they more field hospitals? Were they going to be poorly manned? Perhaps. These are specialties I don't know much about the inner workings, but we had more. And so that means more is possible if we're under enough pressure.
Right.
So now that we're back down to 2,500, we are sort of admitting overall there is less pressure. So to go through more shutdowns and threats of shutdowns and mandates when we actually have more capacity than we are exhibiting at the moment doesn't seem to jive with me.
Yeah. Well, and again, it might just be that there's less frontline workers to because I heard something the other day where it's not really a problem with beds anymore. It's the lack of people to tend to them.
Could very well be, but at this, and certainly an ICU bed would require more more educated people around that kind of person to help them. I just can't help but think that in times of duress, you can't hire and have apprentices and just scaffold. So you get those who have the most experience on the most critical situations, and then maybe you could have young nurses on the lower end of the difficulty level.
Yeah,
and just find your way through this. We're 2 years into it, and we defeated the Germans in 4 years. We turned Ford motor plants into tank producing assembly lines and got the tanks made and sent over.
Yeah,
we have to be able to do better than this.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point.
There's a lot of unemployment. There's a lot, pay the people properly, get them educated, get them into the right positions, and start saving people.
Yeah.
Because instead of shutting down a small business like mine, where my wife and I then had to collect a CERB each, right? That's $2,000 and $2,000-ish, $4,000. Then our business, thankfully, got rent relief. That's several more thousand. We could have stayed open, and you could have given that bundle of money to the hospital.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right? And that's just one small business. There's another $6,000, $7,000. You can simply go month after month. We were closed for 10 months in total. Voila, put all that money towards the hospital and hire the people you need to hire. And small business being the driver of the economy, I can only imagine that $5,000 to $10,000 per every small business being directed to the actual place where you need it, the hospital care, rather than forcing us to be closed. That equation only works if forcing us to be closed resulted in that much less people going to the hospitals.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a lot of that, while I would commend the government on getting that money out quickly, because I did think that was the one thing where I thought,
wonderful.
Yeah, they really did kind of orchestrate that well. But yeah, like you said, like that's I feel like the whole thing was almost politically motivated rather than it being sort of a measurement and a weighing of, what is the better solution here? Is it better to, pay people, and like, is it better to shut things down and have people, staying at home? And by that, a lot of people are going to be out of work.
And which is the permanent solution? Because shutting me down let my business survive, thankfully, during this time. But if we had taken that money instead and given it to the hospitals would still be running on the benefits of that investment of cash.
Right.
So whatever variant is coming in the future, we've now theoretically gone from 2,500 ICU beds to maybe 5,000 capacity.
Right.
And we are more than amply ready for any wave coming, as opposed to putting that money into purchasing vaccines for those who don't need them and spending the billions on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I mean, and you also I always try to give the benefit of the doubt, because when I look at the way the Canadian government in particular, and several governments, not to blame them specifically, but the way they handled it, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, just because it's so often I'm wringing my hands at like how incompetent they seem and how motivated by something other than the public good, or maybe motivated by that, but sort of having a skewed idea of what that is, or at least from my opinion. But I think that they, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, well, maybe there was a short amount of time, they had to make a quick decision, and it was like, look, we have to shut things down. We have to have people staying at home. We don't want this to spread. If that was the advice they were getting from Canada Health, maybe that's the
true. But I've heard before that in order to do a lockdown, every country has their own pandemic planning already in place prior, and even the WHO has guidelines, and the parameters, the criteria in which is necessary to lock down a city or a province, a country. COVID never qualified for the previous criteria and parameters we had in order to say this is worth locking down for.
What are some of the parameters?
Of transmissibility, the amount of death that is happening, that sort of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it never qualified. And
For
somehow
the
broke
WHO one or the Canadian?
both.
Oh, okay.
And somehow we saw what was happening in China, and they were doing the extreme lockdowns, and we at first snickered, well, that will never happen here. And we just followed what China was doing. And we threw out our pandemic planning that had been established through our own medical associations and went with the Chinese model.
Yeah. I wonder if this kind of thing would have played out the same way 50 years ago. Because you think about it, it's like, it doesn't really make sense. There wasn't that many people proportionately dying. Obviously, there was a lot of people dying from it. And, not trying to belittle that, but it's like, is it just that the people who are dying on viral videos that are being, maybe it's too politically damaging to say, maybe it's just, we don't want anybody dying, or at the very least, we want to show that we're doing everything possible to prevent dying, as opposed to taking, is what a government should do, is take in all the sort of, not just health recommendations, but the financial recommendations, the, sociological recommendations or whatever. Like you want to have a solution that works for the most people, and in the best way long term. But I wonder if 50 years ago, maybe you don't have that exposure to the media. The government can be like, look, what makes the most sense is, we tell people to wear masks, socially distance, but we can't shut down the economy. Obviously we would plunge ourselves into a debt that we can never get out of. So, maybe the idea is, I wonder how much of it these days is just politicians wanting to look the best they can.
True. And we have this sort of cultural thing that where, everybody gets a star. So the politician, like whether they actually created a system in which shows benefit or not, is like, well, but I did something. Do I get a star? Look at me. Whereas before it was like, no, I actually need results on this. And, further to that point, 50 years ago, we wouldn't have had a vaccine out so quickly.
Right.
So what would we have done? We
Yeah.
would have wore a mask, perhaps, because we still don't really have great randomized control trials on whether masking works or not. Certainly in light of Omicron, it seems exceedingly unlikely unless you're doing one of those N95 masks.
Why does it seem unlikely?
Well, there's 150 studies that show that masking, and by masking I mean cloth masking, because there's a lot of nuance in what is a mask and how to wear the mask. There is 150 studies that show that in light of Omicron and perhaps even Delta, masking does not do more benefit than harm. This is medical. These are in papers. This is research. And you're talking about consensus and expert opinion before. If you actually get into scientists debating this stuff, you will not find a lot of consensus on whether the masking is actually doing anything right now.
Well, my understanding is, the N95 masks are effective. Other ones are not.
Sure, but the WHO also recommends you cannot wear one of those for 8 hours a day.
The N95
Yes.
ones? Huh.
So now we have something that works in short bursts, but you're not going to have society wearing one of those masks for 9-10 hours a day.
Why aren't they recommending that?
I haven't looked at it recently. Fit, comfort, stuff of that nature.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's definitely not recommended to wear 8, 9, 10 hours a day. So then you go back to the cloth, but then the cloth in light of Omicron is not particularly effective, so...
Well, if it's not particularly effective, then maybe it's effective enough to be something,
Perhaps.
I don't know the numbers on
Perhaps.
it. But
Enough to mandate, though?
Yeah. No, yeah.
I can't really, and this is the nature of the podcast, but there are a lot of studies that basically show they are ineffective.
Right. Maybe we can link
and
some.
by ineffective, yeah, definitely. And by ineffective, what I mean is that the costs, it's not that they don't have a certain amount of efficacy, but the costs do not outweigh, the benefits do not outweigh the costs.
I see. Well, what are the costs in that kind of a...
What it does to society, children, sociological, learning.
Oh, I see. Yeah,
there's all sort of parameters that go into this, not just simply, do you catch the virus or not? There's a lot of stuff going on there. There's 150 studies. Brownstone Institute is a great website for anyone listening who has very qualified experts in their fields write detailed articles with all the studies linked to them. And it's one of the single best resources anybody can just tap into, So yeah, definitely, I would recommend that. And back to your point, 50 years ago, I think we might have just done a little bit of reduced capacity, perhaps masking, and again, not being so sensationalized on television, and hopefully people just hunker down for a year or two and not get too sick. The vast, vast, vast majority of people who caught even COVID, the Alpha variant and Delta, would have been like, it was a really bad flu for a week.
Right.
I think 50% of people are asymptomatic. Light symptoms are for 85% of the population. So you're only really dealing with 15% that are even going to have heavy duty symptoms. So again, 50 years ago, I don't know if we would have shut down all of society for just 15% of people dealing with heavy symptoms.
Right.
Of which, of that 15%, of the total of 100%, 1% may end up in hospital.
Okay, so we want to get back to talking about the reasons we had for not getting the vaccine in the first place. Well, point of full disclosure here, I ended up getting the vaccine. It was late on in it, but it was I had a wedding coming up and I had work. The temperature of the climate at work was such that I knew that I would have to get one soon, and there were a few things. Well, just in society, wanting to participate in society, wanting to be there for Christmas again, wanting to do all the things that one would expect one to be able to do. Most of my family, well, I think everyone in my family had gotten it, it was just to a point where it was like, look, if I'm not getting it, I just don't get to kind of participate in family get-togethers anymore.
And to be fair, nobody had dropped dead in your family yet, so you're like, it's all right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
there had been
anecdotal evidence to be very afraid of this.
And while I was very skeptical of getting it, and and still, I've through the whole thing, I've always thought I would rather not get it. There was nothing, part of me was like, maybe I'm being a little bit ridiculous about this. Like and really, I say that, but knowing in my heart that I wasn't, knowing, you know what I mean? And this actually still grinds my gears, if that's even a phrase that people use anymore about this, is that I knew in my heart, I feel like I went against my conscience by getting it. I really do. And it's unfortunate now, like whatever it was done is done. I hope to never make that mistake again, just in general in life. But I felt strongly enough about it that, and like, people who sort of held out and got past the storm, I think like, although most of you people have gotten COVID, now that the friends of mine that didn't get the vaccine, a lot of you ended up getting
We were
COVID.
talking about this and just to that last point there, us too, between my wife and myself, our families, we are by far the most restrictive with our movements, to like an A+ degree. Like I just hugged my mother for the first time in over 2 years a week ago, and haven't had a coffee or cake or anything inside either house until Christmas. This year we had our in-laws over, which would have been just shy of 2 years, anybody stepping foot in our house. Yet we caught it as well. In our case, I would say it's the nature of a job. I'm beside people for an hour at a time, so I think any mask, if you're beside somebody for over an hour, is going to have a very challenging time.
Yeah, just probability.
Probability in that particular nature. But yeah, I think there might be something to your stats. However, it's now no longer available. Maybe it will come back on. But if you go to the Ontario database on their official website, they had this one section where they had, let's see if I can get the title right, like rates of cases per 100,000 based on vaccination status. And they had 3 different components of the status: vaccinated, partially vaccinated, or not vaccinated at all. And the vaccinated people in Ontario during the Omicron wave were catching it at higher rates per 100,000 than non-vaccinated people. Now, is that because of some sort of immune system fatigue? Is this some sort of, you just got your booster and your body's actually lower before it peaks at the high point, and it happened to be at the wrong time during the actual Omicron when it was ripping through society? Is it because vaccinated versus unvaccinated people behave differently? Like I don't want to just attribute it just to vaccines or doing something bad to those who got vaccinated at all. But those were the numbers. And now if you go back to the website, that chart is no longer available. It has one of those little I for information, and it says this information is no longer available due to technical difficulties.
Really?
Honest
Invoking
to
technical
God.
difficulties.
Yes.
But isn't that the difference in the? Can you say this? Can you say that again? The statistics.
The people who were vaccinated versus non-vaccinated in Ontario during the Omicron wave were catching it, I believe, at 2.7 times greater frequency per 100,000 than non-vaccinated people.
So out of 100,000 people, and I'm explaining this both for our listeners, but also because I always have a tough time wrapping my head around numbers. So it's they take 100,000 people who are vaccinated, 100,000 people who are non-vaccinated, and the rate at which people were catching the virus was 2.7 times higher in the vaccinated people.
Yes. So if you wanted to do a lowest common denominator and call it 1 person per 100,000, and it wasn't 1, it was higher than 1. For every 1, it'd be 2.7 of the other group.
Right.
And so if it was 4, it'd be times 2.7 for the other group and onwards.
Right.
Yeah, and now as the thing has receded, as the numbers come closer again, but that's what they would refer to. And there's other studies out of Denmark that show the exact same thing as well. So it isn't just something we saw in Ontario. And even in the New York Times had an article just a little while ago about this, saying this is what they call immune system fatigue. And you can't just keep hitting yourself. You will get higher antibodies if you check the day after getting a vaccine. But what happens over the course of those 90 days while being freshly vaccinated is uncertain at the best. So after the second dose, we had efficacy for 20 weeks. After the booster, 10 weeks. So now, as you go into the fourth, if we follow the same trend, will it be less than 10 weeks? It looks like it's skewing in that direction. And so if we keep hitting ourselves, one theory that many experts around the world now are talking about, to the point that it's even in the New York Times, is that if we keep hitting our bodies with these vaccines, are we creating an immunity fatigue, which left unchecked might mean you need a shot every single month?
Right.
With the vaccines we currently have. If there's new ones in the pipeline, c'est la vie. We'll see if in the fall, if there's a variant-proof, Omicron-specific, once every 12 months needing dosage. But I'll wait until I see the stats that they actually prove it, because that's what they promised us with the initial one.
Right. Yeah.
And it didn't pan out. It was always just another variant away and more research away from that not playing out either.
Yeah.
So, fool me once, shame on me.
Yeah.
Shame on you.
The ratio. Yeah. I think it was on the same Dark Horse show where Brett Weinstein makes this, sort of makes the case that there is a bit of a false equivalency going on with this when the vaccines were rolled out. Because, people see the syringe and associate in their minds, just the word vaccine with, these things are all safe. We've been doing this for decades. Everything is, there's nothing unusual about this. We'll just get the vaccine for COVID like we've gotten the vaccine for, chicken pox and any other number of things. I think people who actually knew what he was saying is like the, biologists and people who actually knew what was going into these vaccines knew how original these were and how novel they were. And it's sort of like comparing apples and oranges to say that, this is the same, this is your grandmother's vaccine or whatever. He sort of dramatically used the example of, if you go into a room and you see a gun on the table and you put the gun to your temple and you shoot it and it just goes click. Does that mean that the gun is safe? It's like, probably not. It means that, you sort of got by that time. It sort of illustrates the difference between what these mRNA vaccines as opposed to traditional vaccines, because it's a new thing that came along that, and within, months they had started pushing out the vaccines.
Well, and to that effect, the goalpost kept changing, because at first the rhetoric around it was, it's a novel technology. It's fantastic. mRNA vaccines. We never were able to produce vaccines in such a short period of time. This is an exciting new field that's emerging. As more data was coming through and we needed perhaps a third shot, we saw in Israel, and adverse reactions were going up. Well, they've been studied for over 10 years now, perhaps 20. Well, that's not quite so novel anymore, is it? You kind of switch the story around it now. And so there was a lot of story weaving that was going on as well.
Yeah. I think, and that's really okay. So let's get to this, because it's a lot of the heart of this. Like, I know we both listen to the same podcast, read a lot of the same stuff, and I think that our impressions on what to do with this issue as to whether we would get the vaccine or not were probably formed by a lot of the stuff that we read and watched or listened to, and so. Let's get into some of the big characters in this, like Dr. Robert Malone, for example. So we've never really talked about him, I don't think.
No,
So I'm curious your opinion on him, because he's sort of held out, like, on the one side, it's like, look at this guy, one of the creators of the mRNA vaccine. Like, he obviously knows what he's talking about. Like, if you say that you invented the vaccine that people are putting in their bodies and you're against that, I mean, that's a pretty damaging thing. And for anyone who doesn't know, Dr. Malone is somebody who has been very outspoken against the COVID vaccinations, but is also, I don't want to say self-styled. Like, I think that he was sort of fundamental, to my understanding, in inventing the mRNA technology.
I might have heard even as many as 20 patents in his name regarding the original mRNA technology.
Right.
Yep.
But he's described similar, I was listening to something the other day, and they were describing a Joe Rogan podcast that had Dr. Malone on it. He was described as the discredited Robert Malone. It's like, well, and it was said so casually. It was like, well, everybody knows he's discredited. It's like, why is he discredited? Like, what are the reasons? Can
Not
you speak
at all.
to this?
It was I listened to it. I thought it was a really good conversation. As one on Rogan, I've heard him. Probably listened to 50 hours worth of Dr. Malone in the last year alone. He's human, and the problem, if I can just be counterpoint to this, is that when you start to, and he can get into very technical nuances about how this goes, a very small fraction of society understands what he's talking about. Right. So you can be overwhelmed by the technical side, and then the narrative that he's sort of saying that, it's not, I don't think he says he's against vaccination. He's just against mass vaccinations and mandates around vaccinations. I think I've heard him enough times say over 60, 65, immunocompromised, by all means, go get it. It's your best chance at the moment. But in conjunction with any other therapy that may be available for this as well. I don't find him to be an absolutist on this, which is something you don't really hear about in the mainstream media for the most part, I think. What were you going to say?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, well, because I remember hearing him talking specifically about the COVID vaccinations, saying, how he was very concerned about the spike protein coming loose, and this is probably, early 2021, I want to say, and I don't know, like most people, I don't know, I'm listening to this guy talk, and it's like, well, he sounds like sounds very credentialed in terms of this, and he's saying it's bad. Like, that's the extent.
I believe he said, I've heard it before, just working off memory, but that it's okay 2 doses for some people. 3 doses and beyond, probably not. And in terms of vaccinating anybody under the age of 30 and is healthy, definitely not. It's all about also how many years do you expect left to live, and cost benefit analysis, and that's all in light of Alpha and perhaps Delta. With Omicron, it completely changes. So I'm sure if we listen to his point of view of vaccination in regards to Omicron, that would definitely change the whole skewing of it as well. But no, I think he means well. I think he's sincere. he's not infallible. You know, you're all of a sudden now on the news and feeling like a rock star and being asked to do 2 or 3 different shows per day. And you definitely have to be careful. All I suggest is when somebody listens to, and I do recommend listening to a little bit of Dr. Malone, counterbalance that with critique on the other side and just find out what's going on. I think he adds a very important component to understanding our way out of this predicament. And you can't simply understand the full breadth of what we're supposed to do without putting some time into Dr. Malone.
Right.
You know, I wouldn't put all your eggs in one basket, but he certainly deserves to be at the table.
Yeah, I think there's a really effect that the media is masterful at this in casting things in a very binary way. Like, and the thing is, like you said, like everybody's human. So, you're always going to be, some people are going to make mistakes. Sometimes you'll have some good moments. Some things might be a little disingenuous. Like there's always something to balance. But like what the media is able to do is pluck one of the sort of disingenuous things. And I'm not even speaking about Dr. Malone. Like just in any situation, like you were talking earlier about Russell Brand, it's like you can take the worst parts of anybody's characteristics and cast them as a villain, right? Like, we've all done something. So it's like you find that, just keep blasting that through the media over and over. And it's like, yeah, this person's horrible, or this person's like a charlatan. And I think that it goes the other way too. So it's like, Dr. Fauci is like, look at this guy who was like head of, like AIDS research back when. And
just to your point, I'm not saying Dr. Malone knows anything about what he's saying and whether we should listen to him. But those who are qualified, like a Dr. Fauci, would it not be a ratings extravaganza to have both of them on a podcast together, or CBC or the CNN or Fox or Al Jazeera's, BBC, and say, we're going to have a 1-hour special of these 2 doctors debating one another.
Yeah.
It would literally be as popular as a UFC fight. They would have a ratings bonanza, and then the public can decide for themselves which doctor they prefer. But I'll let him at least be questioned by his peers in a way that we can actually listen, instead of being relegated to the having to do the podcast trail and going around and just talking to you and I.
Yeah.
The fact that people don't engage him en masse puts a red flag to me, and I don't think it's because he's completely off his rocker.
Yeah.
I just don't want to engage him because he probably knows much, much more than them, and they're going to expose their own weaknesses. So therefore, and regarding to how you started this segment now about whether you wanted to get vaccinated or not, that would put up a red flag. Why are not all voices being invited to the table so I can make an informed decision?
Yeah, and I would say that that's the biggest reason for me too, is the censorship surrounding certain individuals and certain topics, like the ivermectin topic. Like why, it is being presented by sort of alternative media, or whatever the term is that is describing, like, shows.
Alternative here, but in many countries around the world, it's part of their protocols.
Right.
So it's quite interesting because we are in our own little bubbles here thinking, well, the way we're doing it is the right way and the way the whole world should be doing it.
Right. Yeah. But why is something like ivermectin? It's like, I just remember the whole horse tranquilizer thing, and it's like, here's a drug that is safe. It's proven that it's safe, that it is, whether like there were studies, and I don't know where we are. I haven't been following this stuff for like a year now, but there were studies that were showing ivermectin was effective. I remember Pierre Corey was, a big ivermectin, and he, and he also worked, on the front line of this stuff. So really had a, I think, fairly hands-on idea of what therapies would work and what wouldn't work, and and again, like I'm obviously no expert in this, but all I can do is, hear from people who sound like they should be experts, like people who have, the credentials to match. And when you hear people like that saying, like, look, ivermectin, seems like it's something that a drug that can work, and why aren't we talking about this? And then of course you have the narrative, well, the drug companies wouldn't make any money off of ivermectin because there's no patent for it or whatever.
Well, the traumatizing, terrorizing thing for me is every person I engage with who, when it happens to come up in conversation, because most people have heard of the drug now, ivermectin. Within a heartbeat, you hear the word horse dewormer from their mouths.
Right, that's what I meant. Yeah.
And it is unbelievable because these are intelligent people and they just simply can only know what they know.
Yeah.
So they turn on the TV and they're told ivermectin Horse dewormer. So would that make sense that every time you heard the word penicillin, horse dewormer, eh?
Yeah.
That's what you're taking now. And people don't seem to connect the dots on these two different. So when I tell them this is on the ivermectin's on the WHO's list of top 25 most essential drugs, it's been administered. They won a Nobel Prize for administering it to humans, not for COVID, but for parasites, yellow fever, dengue, things we don't have in North America for the most part. And that, if prescribed by a doctor for a human, it is very safe in the realms of somewhere like a Tylenol or something like that. I'm not saying it works. I'm not saying it doesn't work. All I'm saying is if a qualified doctor wishes to be able to prescribe that to their patient, how can you justify that same doctor can prescribe opioids but can't prescribe ivermectin?
Yeah, but very politicized.
It's unbelievable. And I'm not saying it works. I'm saying let a professional decide. Let them look at the studies. And then if I see en masse that it's just not working and there's a couple of crazy doctors that are doing it, but you know what? I'm going to turn my head back towards the vaccine solution. I'm going to give that a second look. I think this is my path.
Right. But immediately there was, censorship around it. Everybody who talked about ivermectin as a potential solution was, labeled crazy or whatever. And then you get, situations like Joe Rogan where it's, he's castigated for using it by, CNN using the horse dewormer label. And it's like, it really is. And it's kind of like what I was saying in the earlier monologue where it's just this like, you can start a conversation with somebody and the minute you say a certain trigger word, like an ivermectin or like, I haven't been vaccinated. It's like, immediately all these assumptions just crowd the person's mind. They're not even interested in anything else that you're saying.
And that's what I find. I made the error early on saying, well, there's these studies, just being naive and trying to be altruistic and find and the studies show, and I know there's not a lot, but we only base mixing and matching of different mRNA vaccines on one or two small studies, and we're like, that's good to go. We can do this, and you can say yes to that. So the mechanisms in place were able to lower the standards when it suited their narrative. Let's say mixing and matching, 2 studies, let's rock, it's good to go. But now we have something like 50 to 100 studies showing ivermectin looks like it may actually work. No, well, we just don't have a 10,000 person gold standard randomized control trial, so we're just not going to start that. I think the booster studies were based on a total number of 380 participants. Whether to vaccinate under 12 or 18 was somewhere around 1,500 to 3,000.
Right.
So they were able to lower the standards to get the green light for that, but then they take and increase the standards in order to have ivermectin to this, sort of stratospheric level that unless you are a Pfizer with $1 billion in the bank, you're not going to be able to fund such a thing.
Yeah. Well, what's funny about that is when you think of the COVID vaccines and those studies, now they're like, well, we have the vaccine sample size now, because it's happening in the general population. And it's like, really? This is now the study that, you know what I mean? So you've already deployed it. And now in sort of retroactively, you're claiming that this is the study.
There was actually a quote on that during one of the very boring, where people would teleconference in different doctors about the FDA approval regarding, I believe it was vaccinating kids under a certain age. And one of the regulatory advisors there were like, well, we'll just never know unless we try.
Right. That's what you want to hear when you're rolling out.
Wow.
Yeah.
You really just said that. These are people's children, right? And they're actually, what are you trying to solve? The rate of death and severe illness is so minute.
Yeah.
You're going to actually, if just one more child dies than you save, you've murdered that child.
Right.
Willingly. Yeah.
Well, and this is, I'm sure you've, that Norman Doidge essay, right? Where
I've heard of it.
Yeah. And he was on the Jordan Peterson podcast, and
Needle Points.
Needle Points, yeah.
Yes. I actually did listen to the entirety of it. It's 3 hours.
Yep. Yeah. So it's and very talking about the history of vaccine history and the history of the CDC and the healthcare, military experiments like the Tuskegee stuff. It's
absolutely.
There has been a long history of government. And again, I say the word government. All of a sudden I feel like, people are going to be listening to this thinking, oh, here comes the conspiracies. But it's like, no, it's not a conspiracy. These kinds of things happen. These were they did experiments knowing that when they, with under the moniker of this is for the greater good, which maybe very well could have been, but you're still taking individuals and giving them something, for example, that is going to harm them, but it's just they're just doing that just so they can see it. And in the case of Tuskegee, they were giving them a placebo instead of treating their actual disease because they wanted to watch how they died and study how they died. And, it's like there's this history, and it's not like this is like, hundreds of years ago. Like, this is all like a lot of this stuff happened,
and
recently.
When you look at, and I believe it's in the same essay, but you can find it anywhere, the largest fines in conjunction or larger single fines for criminal activities in American history, it falls on the shoulders of the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, yeah.
So would you trust me if I had the largest criminal fine of all time?
Right.
You probably shouldn't.
Right, right.
Your odds are in favor.
Yeah.
You shouldn't trust me.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It's unfortunately, and we do need the pharmaceuticals, but I view them as a necessary evil. You have to play ball with them a little bit.
Yeah, and even that is kind of like, okay, yeah, like you said, like a necessary evil. But what kills me is this whole attitude of, well, you must be crazy if you don't want to take the vaccine. And it's like, don't you follow the science? And yeah, I mean, just like logic dictates I would want to be a little bit skeptical about this. Like, look at history.
Well, critical thinking requires you to be critical, and I think we've eliminated the critical and the thinking out of our approach to this. Science has become this sort of shiny tower of infallibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you just simply cannot. I sometimes feel like I'm Galileo, trying to tell the church. But in this case, the church is the industry of science, and I have a dissenting opinion, and you're just castrated out of society.
We talked about her earlier. Not on the show, but was it? I want to say Western. Was it University of Western?
Yes, Julie Ponesse.
Yeah, that's her. Dr. Ponesse, and she was a doctor of philosophy and ethics.
I believe so. Yeah,
from Western University, and she was fired for not getting the vaccine, and she was a professor of ethics at Western, and she made this heartfelt plea, as sort of her last communique, I guess, on YouTube or wherever she posted it. But it was this 5-minute great, really summation of why she's just talking about as an ethicist, where she stands on forcing somebody to put something into your body, and it's really powerful. You can see that it really did remind me that you said Galileo. It reminds me of that kind of a situation where it's you're when it comes to a point where you're standing, you're like, wow, this is really happening. I have to stand up on my principles against something that's very real. You almost take these ideas, you hear about them in movies and in books where it's you're so abstracted from that whole hero dilemma kind of thing. But it's there are people who actually have to make those decisions, and more so in the COVID years where it's you have to decide, do I want to stand on my principle on this, or do I want to lose my job? Because that's a very real thing.
It's a moral dilemma on the scale of David and Goliath.
Yeah.
And the table is tilted. And at that point, with that amount of, conviction, these people, and I would include myself in them, are simply there's something in the moral fiber that says, I will not capitulate to this, even if it means my demise.
Right.
Economically, my life, whatever. Not your loved ones. You'll always do something for your loved ones. But this gets to the very fiber of their essence. And it's actually, when you're tested is when you get to really see what you're all about.
Right.
Now, I did hear COVID didn't really change us. It just revealed who we really are. And when it's under that pressure, and when you strip everything away and go, what am I all about? I only have a small 100-year window of consciousness to be part of this beautiful thing of the universe. Damn it, where am I going to make my stand? And when you look at it and pan back over the 4 billion years of the universe, who cares if you live to 90 or 50? It's what you stood for in those years that mattered.
Yeah.
And you can tell in her conviction in those 4 minutes, the clarity of thought, this woman has made up her mind and she's taking what she believes is the right moral stand.
Yeah.
And then we have to weigh moral stands and what it means to society versus simply versus the efficiency of numbers and virology. Because what's the point of society surviving if the society that survives is not something we're proud of?
Right.
And I think that's something when you get technocratic, and I believe we're falling into a trap of numbers and algorithms and a sort of technocratic way of running the planet, that we're losing that moral waypoints, those moral goalposts, that sense of history and how fragile the freedoms that we have now are, and how we have to be so, yes, we have a fantastic system that is full of inefficiencies, but it would be a massive mistake to say, let's tear it all down and start over again. The new system will be better.
Yeah.
Because the problem isn't perhaps the system, it's us within the system.
Right.
And at that moment, she was showing you that it's the morality that matters more than the actual technocratic side.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that just speaks to the truth of it.
Yeah, in society these days, it's like we're getting better at the how, but less aware of the why.
Very
and
well said,
I really found her. I really found her what she sort of stood for moving in the same way. Jordan Peterson did the same thing over free speech. It's you never know when that moment's going to come. And you always want, I'm sure I know I have this idea of how my life's going to pan out. And of course, God and making plans and all that, laughing at us. So I don't, when those kinds of I guess one of the reasons I'm kicking myself for getting the vaccine eventually is I know that I went against what I should have done. It's not like I murdered somebody or something, or I'm plagued with regret. But I do think I should have stood on principle with that. It would have been tough, but I could have done it because But in my mind, I was like, well, I want to keep my job. I want to go to the Christmas this year. I want to go to my brother's wedding. So it's but there's always I think that kind of your principles will almost always demand a sacrifice, and you never know when it's going to come, when your time is going to come. You
do always have the ability to say no, but that no comes at a cost.
Yes,
and you just have to am I willing to accept such a cost? Let me ask you, what percentage of Canadians are vaccinated? We're at 90% or so. What percentage of that 90% got vaccinated through coercion and family pressure and everything else?
Yeah, interesting to know.
Right? So we're always so proud to tout, I'm so proud of Canadians, 90% vaccinated. Well, let's back that up a little bit. Probably, I'm guessing 40 to 50% would have went and got the vaccine. And as a large proportion of them should, because they're immunocompromised, have health issues, of age, all the different risk factors that we know are necessary. But to say, coercing the other 40% of your population was a good thing to do, the right thing to do, or something to celebrate when you hit the 90% number, I think it's very disingenuous.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a real, along with the censorship as being one of the biggest problems I had with all this, so the shaming was another. And our Prime Minister Trudeau with his... I just remember things he would say and the way he would say them. It really fed into the whole anti-vax, hatred that there seemed to be. It was and to some extent, you can take things out of context. I get that you wouldn't necessarily want to sit next to an anti-vaxxer on the bus. I wouldn't either. Just you know what I mean. Just it's kind of because you think to yourself, well, in theory, or even not if it's almost intuitively, it's you would think that they would have a higher risk of passing something on to you.
They haven't taken part in the medical intervention that everybody has been told will get you on the path of getting all of society through this. And so, I don't care if it's 5%, 10%, 40%. It's a percentage, and I don't want to play ball with that. I totally understand. Do you know, though, that the Canadian military admitted during this time that they were using military-grade psychological operations on the population and testing them out?
So, describe that.
I don't know the details of the exact nature of what they were doing.
Well, in what context did they sort of reveal this?
It was a news report.
what was the new? So is that just like they just released a statement
Yeah.
and said they were going to?
Yeah. It was something like that. I can pull it up at a certain point. But that's what they said. Just like the Trudeau government had admitted they were spying on 33 million cell phones. And they just
Yeah.
flat out said it through a news report at a certain point. And of course, privacy advocates were like, what is this all about? How is this even possible? It's not part of the regular nightly news anymore, either story.
Right. Yeah.
So again, I'm just nothing but sympathetic for everybody, in particular yourself in this position, because you had to just weigh the odds, and there is a sort of go along to get along vibe.
Yeah.
It's just
Well, one of the worst things is this whole like you got to do your part. Putting that burden of again, give me a polio even. Give me something that has a really high, or not even really high, marginally high rate of death. Maybe at 10% even. Like I would still argue for individual rights at that point, but I can understand an argument at that point where it's like, look,
absolutely,
you want to do
yeah.
your part, and it's like, well, I'm doing my part by staying away from people, whatever. But this idea to force somebody to put something in their body, I mean, it is incredible that we're even at the point over something so small. Like you say psychological warfare, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of, when you think of the small probability of death from this virus, relatively speaking, less than 1%. So, okay, still high, like, enough people, like that's still a high number. But, like you said, that skews toward a certain demographic. But the intense shaming, the shutting down of society, those
those are the psychological operations right there.
Yeah, it really becomes, if we're willing to do this for that, I imagine there was a real,
Quite scary.
an even more devastating.
Quite scary how quickly people jumped up. Yeah, I would see it on TV, but you'd see the whole process. I come from a very religious background, but you'd see people lining up, kind of like getting communion in a church,
Right.
lining up to get their vaccine, waiting patiently in line. They take the magic vaccine. Then they go down the hallway. If all the posters set up on the wall, you stand in front, you take your picture, just kind of like when you have your child come out of the church and here's your baptismal photos,
Right.
And you get to then post that on social media and declare to the world that you are now part of the good tribe.
Right.
You have been christened into the new sciencism. It does take on the same beats of a religion.
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
There is very strong tribal and evolutionary processes. Why religion is still around is because these things work to help keep a society together. And those elements were being used through the vaccination as well. It was almost like some sort of elation, some sort of joy, some sort of revelation that they got to participate. I've heard from many friends and clients and whatnot who are like, I felt so privileged to be able to even get the vaccine early because of the nature of my job. You're
Right.
like, wow, really? Okay. Like it's medicine of a sort,
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's funny how it really became almost a status symbol. It's like, well, like, oh, how many vaccinations have you got? You know what I mean? Did you get your booster? Like, what's even considered vaccinated anymore, right? Like, if when you're talking about studies of people being vaccinated, are they talking about, somebody who's had the 2 vaccinations, or is it 2 vaccinations plus a booster? Because there's some studies coming out of Israel that were like, it was a little questionable how they were describing. They were talking about people who are vaccinated, but they were talking about like they consider, and I could be wrong on this, so they consider vaccinated to be whatever the latest booster is.
Yeah, for sure. No, yeah, you had your vaccines updated.
Yeah.
But just to go back to the psychological and just how we could draw maybe like a funny little parallel to modern society. Imagine every time somebody bought a green car, a Tesla, let's say, and
do they make green Teslas? I've never seen one, but it actually, you said that, and I was like, oh wow.
Yeah. So like, let's say when you bought like a battery operated, good for the environment car, and then you, as you purchased your car, you got to go down a hallway. You had to wait a long time. Feel lucky you were able to buy one. You took a picture of yourself. You posted it to social media. I am now part of the tribe that's doing better for the world.
Right.
And after a while, once the adoption of green technology hit the normal threshold of 30-40% adoption, you started telling people, well, if you don't get a green car, you won't be able to drive anymore. We won't renew your license sticker. Like the coercion part starts to kick in. You can create around almost anything the exact same psychological mechanisms in which then people feel happy to participate, or then like they must participate in order to get to that point.
Well, but this brings up an interesting question, and we've talked about it before. Like, who are the they, right? Like, so you mentioned the Canadian military, which I want to know more about that story, and like, I don't know, maybe do a break and you can, because I'm curious. That seems an odd thing for them to sort of declare. I don't know if they were pressure to do it or why they did it, but. But I would say that it's when people talk about this, like, you see how COVID happens. You see things like pharmaceutical companies, like their profits going up and everything, and you're like, it's pretty easy to put together the pieces, but you're like, is it really this simple? Is it really just about money? And who are these people that are always the people are talking about the Great Reset and this and that? It's like, well, who is this cabal of like Bond villains that are out there trying to distort the world to their whims?
Who are they?
Who are they? Or is it just is that how things coalesce?
A multitude of them. There's power, prestige, wanting to leave your legacy. Everybody's trying to do, from their point of view, the right thing for the planet,
So, for example, with green technology, you would say you would say that part of it is people who genuinely want to just reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and that's sort of like, because that's sort of the central core of the idea is like, okay, this is something we have to do. People get into it with sort of a benevolent agenda, but then you by necessity almost corporatize that agenda, because you're like, okay, well. You have an idea, you start a company, the company gets bigger. So now you have, people, middle managers, like people whose agenda it is not necessarily to, achieve the dream of the company, but is to financially do well with their career. So you have people who are, you get a board of directors, you get people
it's
like,
it's
an industry. So is that what happens? And then because in a capitalist society, we're based on that corporation. Then you have these sort of entities onto themselves, which have a self-interest in profit. So at the detriment to maybe even the best intentions of the whole reason the company was formed in the first place.
I think it's different in every single situation. But in terms of like battery operated cars, I don't know if they would have ever got off the ground if they didn't have government subsidies. So then you have corporations and government working in tandem, and then you have to ask yourself, well, why are they doing this? Is it truly greener for the planet? I've never really seen a great analysis. You got to think about, where do you mine the batteries? How do you dispose of them? How do you generate the electricity that goes into your car? Is it still from 40% coal plants? Right. So therefore, coal is actually powering your electric car. Yeah. I would like to see a really detailed analysis. Not that I'm pro petrol in any way, but perhaps smaller cars, more efficient cars, that use less gas, or more trains or anything else. The part that worries me about the electrical, I think it does get a little political. It's a lot more control. I think as the world's population expands, if we ever have an economic crash or things of that nature, the chances of protests getting out of hand are far greater, just due to being able to communicate on different messaging apps and coordinating different protests, things of all that nature. I think the governments of the world are looking for a way to be able to control the amount of civil unrest that may unfold if things ever go wrong. And so part of that could be, like, you could argue, not to go too far ahead, but if cars are all run on a grid of sorts and protesters were going to a particular place, you could simply shut off their cars so they can't get to such a place.
Right.
Particularly if your digital ID on your phone is used to turn on your car as you get near it, and all these convenience factors.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of layers to this story that need to be sussed out. And I definitely love technology. I want to see my fear in this case is that technology is changing at a rate much faster than our understanding of it and how it affects society. And then from that point, what laws do we need to put in place in order to keep civil rights at least at the level we're experiencing now, and no less?
during mid 2021, there was a lot of information that just wasn't being portrayed in the mainstream media, and if it was being cast as there was aspersions being cast at it. So like you had Dr. Malone being somebody, a lot of you would have Brett Weinstein and his Dark Horse podcast being demonetized, I think, on YouTube.
They took ivermectin on in one of their podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was a thing.
Yeah,
they had the Dr. Malone and Stephen Kirsch on, and that was the one I think that actually got them demonetized, which was a fantastic 3-hour delving into the Freedom of Information Act and the traveling spike protein from the Japanese, believe database they were pulling those numbers from.
And I think one of the biggest reasons, like you said, like that I was so skeptical about getting the vaccine was because there was just so many things that were like, it was like this veneer of, it was really like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and you just see this almost blank look come over people's face. It's like, did you get the vaccine? And it's like, well, wait a minute. What about this other stuff? It's like, you're not allowed to talk about that. And it's like, why? And it's like, you're not supposed to even ask why.
You're witnessing psychological operations happening in real time, and it bypasses people's intellectual capacities.
It does, because there's a lot of smart people who, did just get they got the vaccine. Like, my dad, again, is a smart guy. Like, So let's just get to some of the other sort of statistics. So there's a lot of stuff coming out. I remember hearing, I don't know what the statistics are on this, and maybe you do. Were there people, I don't know if this is a rumor or if it's, it's so hard to suss out the truth these days. Were there a significant amount of people in the CDC or in other organizations that were not getting the vaccine right away? Like, do you know anything about that?
I did see some congressional testimony at some point. They were drilling them, and the numbers weren't particularly high, but in line with like what America is in general, because this was all coming out of the States.
Right.
Some, I'm going to just ballpark it, like 30 to 60% or somewhere there had been vaccinated, and they twist and turn, and we don't have those numbers, but it wasn't like some outstanding, like
wasn't
99% of people have gone.
Right.
Whereas Dr. Panesi had said in a podcast I was listening to that 98% of all university faculty across Canada had been vaccinated. So you didn't hear that type of overwhelming statistics coming out of the CDC or whatnot, Pfizer employees or Moderna employees or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I would hear stories, and I'm speaking anecdotally, and I hate this because I feel like this is not helping anybody, but I would hear stories about like physicians who were, getting in trouble for, not advocating for vaccinations, or maybe not even getting vaccinated themselves. Although I've heard numbers since that suggest that upward of 98% of physicians got vaccinated. I don't know.
Well, that is interesting, because I did see a study that came out that said, based on educational levels, who are the people that are most unvaccinated, and it was people with PhDs. Right,
which I thought, I heard the same thing. That is interesting.
Now, to be counterpoint to that point, the problem with perhaps having the intellect to be able to be a PhD.
They're all PhDs in sociology.
Yeah. You can see a lot of nuance here and there, but it doesn't mean you're an expert in what you're trying to decide on, which is virology and epidemiology and whatnot. So I'm not saying they made a right decision. I just thought it was interesting that this whole idea that it had to be the sort of backwoods, burly truck driver that decided not to get vaccinated actually wasn't statistically at all true.
That is the impression that they try to create is like Trump loving, anti-vaxxers.
The better way. This is the path. Right. These are the experts. Don't you want to be part of the intellectual and winning team?
Follow the science. The VAERS database was another thing, and maybe if you can you want to describe what that is?
Well, again, most people don't know about this, and that's fine as we got into this, but we're 2 years into it, and most people still don't know about it. So just backing up a little bit, I love a robust conversation. But one of my, I've never really, if everybody I've ever talked to, and I talk to a lot of people daily, heard very strong arguments for why they got vaccinated, or why that is the right way to go about it, or why an unvaccinated person is wrong. It just comes off as very superficial, like you're reading the features and benefits of a hair tonic, and that's it. And there's no deeper delving into the mechanisms behind. So that's where I feel like it does bypass intellect, and people have just picked an emotional side and decided that's the way we need to go. That's really concerning to me because I love, the last thing I want are my own stale thoughts banging around my head. Please challenge me. Tell me why you believe what you believe. And I've rarely met anyone that could really articulate why they did in any form of a scientific, reasoning other than that's what the experts say.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
So just to interject. So because that's the argument is like, you know what? I think about 100 things a day. I don't want to think about this. The experts are saying I should get the vaccine, so I'll get the vaccine. Now, I think the disparity here is like, yes, that is what the quote I'm quoting on our audio only podcast. The experts are saying this, but what's not sort of being reported is that other experts are saying other things. Mm-hmm. There are the statistics are overwhelmingly. The statistics are disturbing in the sense that it doesn't seem to reflect the measures that are being enforced, like in terms of shutting down businesses and like closing, like mask mandates and everything like that. It doesn't seem to be enough to take us to that. It never seemed to be enough to me, the risk and the amount of people dying or getting sick never seemed to be enough to me to justify the infringement on rights. Like, of course, yeah. And you always think like, well, if this is going to do that, what would happen if we had a bigger disease? But asking about, so you get into things like, the VAERS database. There was a lot of controversy over the numbers that were being shown there. Mm-hmm. And like, I think that's one of the things where I thought like, well, that's weird. Why? So like, maybe if you can describe a bit about the VAERS database.
So the problem with I believe it stands for Vaccine Adverse Event Reaction Site.
Yeah,
system.
something like that.
And I believe the FDA or Pfizer are mandated to have this up. So it isn't like it's some third party. It's the main mechanism for capturing data on adverse reactions due to vaccinations in America. Every country, or maybe in Europe, they have their own generalized system. Canada, we have our own. They have their own capturing sites for such information. The criticism of it is that anybody can put in their own information. But somebody has, it's a website you go to, somebody has an adverse reaction to something, and they're like, hey, I felt a headache, and I just got my vaccine. And now I'm green. Yeah, you can put, but if you put, I've heard that once you enter it, the FDA do contact you. You have to put in all your information when you put it there.
Okay.
Right? And if you lie, it's a criminal offense.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So those are the criticisms that anyone can add it, but there are some goalposts there to keep things going. But I've also read that 74% of all entries are by medical professionals. So it's not perfect. The problem with
why would medical professionals be entering? Oh, because they're doing it on behalf of the patient.
On behalf of the patient that had an adverse reaction. Yeah, absolutely. The problem, and I've heard it explained like this, is that if the information we're getting from VAERS is correct, then we have a big problem in our hands. And if because the numbers were really... Because the numbers are very high.
Yeah.
There's an absolute versus percentage way of looking at it, but long story short, they're very high. I believe vaccines are taken off the market when there's 150 deaths. And the last time I checked, they were in America alone, over 10,000 deaths had been entered into the system.
For the COVID vaccine.
Sometimes I even go in layman's terms. I'm like, well, what if 99% of those deaths are just incorrect? You're still at 100. Right? So we're close to the threshold, if not beyond. So the criticism, so if this system is correct, we have a big problem in our hands. And if it isn't correct, then we can't say they're safe and effective because we do not have a system to monitor these adverse reactions.
Right.
So we're damned if we do, damned if we don't.
Yeah.
Right? So we're going to have to, taking a precautionary principle, assume that they're mostly correct.
Right.
And based on that, again, I would say your own personal choice. Mm-hmm. There are the CDC, NIH, the FDA who approve things, but the data is not overwhelmingly convincing that this is the right solution for everybody.
Right. Yeah.
It's as simple as that. So, in Canada, it's a little different. I heard it's a lot more bureaucratic. It has to go through a board. They determine this and that. But keep in mind, the day before AstraZeneca got banned in Canada, our adverse reaction site on the Canadian and federal and provincial websites were saying vaccines are safe and effective. The day before we got rid of AstraZeneca. 14 countries had already stopped AstraZeneca before us. So I would say Canada faults on the other side, where they're overly cautious with their data to the point where things can slip through, and then we have problems that we need to mop up in the future. Mm-hmm. So I can only imagine how a person must feel in Canada if they got AstraZeneca on a Monday and then on Tuesday they were told we're stopping it now.
Yeah.
There was no, the system is green, but now we're hedging into yellow. It might go red. It was green then red. Right. So that, I don't think that's particularly beneficial to most people in the society either.
Yeah. And again, the argument would probably be everything is happening so fast, so they have to,
True, but we're a G7 country and 14 other countries have banned it already.
Right.
We really should be in the top 5, or by definition 7, looking at this. I mean, not to mention that I believe, to get the numbers, mostly right, it was the blood clotting was the issue of AstraZeneca, and it was something to the effect of 1 in 55,000. That was enough to say we need to stop this. But myocarditis in certain populations of men between 16 and 24 can come out somewhere between 1 in 1,200 and 1 in 5,000. That's 10 times worse than what the blood clots were overall for AstraZeneca.
Right.
So yes, we are switching to Moderna, not Pfizer, looking at it as we should, more nuanced. Again, not an anti-vax statement. It's just like, let's take time to look at the data so we can apply the right medication to the right person. It can't simply be a centralized planning, one size fits all. I just believe in science and I'm going to rush off and get it because they said it was okay mentality.
Yeah.
I tell you one amazing quote though.
Sure.
By Trudeau. Mandates are the only way to avoid restrictions. He said that in Parliament.
That's incredible.
I wrote quote of the century.
Yeah.
Really, mandates are the way to avoid restrictions.
Right. Yeah.
Welcome to your Orwellian nightmare.
He's a brilliant man. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, putting this into some sort of structure. Let's, all these reasons and more were why. Well, let me ask you. So these were things that obviously influenced your decisions not to get the vaccine.
Okay.
No, I'm asking you.
Yeah. What are the reasons?
Well, no, I'm more saying what in like. It was more like a question, but like a state. I formed like a statement, but it was actually a question. Like, so these are the things. These things that we've talked about are things that influenced you not to get the vaccine.
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
Like, is there anything
and
else?
More.
Yeah. Is there anything that really comes to mind that is? Was there any kind of turning point where you were like, oh, like that's a big, for me, it was the censorship. Like for me, it was like these people that you listen to a Dark Horse podcast. I brought them up a few times here, but it's you listen to that and you listen to the way that they're talking about these things, and it is in a very reasonable, a very like they're using logic, they're employing the language they use. It's not absolute. It's not like there's no certainty there. There's a kind of hesitant, let's slowly tread through this and find out together, let's find out what the solution is.
Well, that's sort of the nefariousness that we're trying to fight against, is that if you just take a knee-jerk reaction and do the opposite of what the government says and do the opposite of what Big Pharma says, you'll find yourself on the other side of an equation, an argument that you don't have much scientific standing. The truth is actually in the more dangerous place, which is in the middle. Pfizer's partly right. The government is partly right. They're not totally wrong in this.
Right.
But what parts are right and what parts are wrong? And that takes a lot of sussing out and a lot of effort, and you got to get comfortable being like alt-center in a sense. And I think that's really the place we need to be in. It's going to be an arduous, time-consuming task, but simply knee-jerk reactions to these politicians are awful, throw them all out, let's start the system over again, Big Pharma is only here to kill us, is not the right way to handle it either. Yeah. So you're right. Those long-form conversations have gone a long way. But going back to what you're saying, for me, it's not just about are these things the right way through it? Like, are they the correct mechanism? Are we implementing them in the right way as well? Because that's part of the solution of a society. And if I don't like the way they're implementing the solution, then you're actually adding to the problem or creating at least a secondary problem that may take longer to mop up than the initial problem. So, sort of normalizing coercion, normalizing governments calling unacceptable views and freezing your bank accounts, and you may now be fired from your job and ostracized from society, and be told by Trudeau on French Canadian television that if you do not get the vaccine, you are by definition a racist and misogynist. Why would I want to participate in that sort of problem?
Right.
If anything, I would argue I would avoid taking the vaccine on a personal level, and I do not recommend this for anyone else, because it's my political stand. And I'm willing to risk my life, which is not a large amount based on the data, because I'm at 49 years of age and I have a well over 99% chance of survival. So it isn't like I'm picking a particularly dangerous sword to die on.
Right.
But I would reject the vaccine simply because by participating in this, I'm also participating in creating and legitimizing the system of coercion that's gone on in order to allow this. And I need to take an ethical stand that I am not going to participate in that, even if it means I'm risking my personal life to a little degree.
Yeah. Well said. I think we have to be aware of compromise to some extent. Like, I think there are people who would say, I think a lot of people would say, for example, like, yeah, well, sure, I'm sure the pharmaceutical companies do bad things, and I'm sure that, the government, you can't trust them, sort of generalizing of things where it's like, yeah, there's some good, there's some bad, you're kind of right, like, we'll have to agree to disagree. This whole sort of equivocation where it's like, it's almost like a cloud around like the truth, where it's like, you can present some figures or you can present some data and say, okay, let's take this now. Let's see where this is going to go. They just want to default to something that's safe, something where it's like, I don't feel, you might be kind of right. You might be, a little right. And it's like, no. It's not really about whether I'm right on this or whether I'm not, or whether you're right or whoever's right. Let's figure out the truth together. Let's find out, based on this data, let's go forward from here. And like, we'll find points along the way where it's like, we were wrong about this. Let's correct, and then try to go, but always pursuing the truth. This throwing up your hands and being like, well, there's 2 points of this. If you're just dead certain that it's like, well, if you don't get the vaccine, you're a racist. Like, and there's just no arguing. I mean, that's its own horror. But I think a more common one is just this. If you push too hard, especially with friends or family, you get this kind of like, look, let's agree to disagree. It's like, yeah, but can't we talk about it anymore? Like, why don't we talk about it?
I think the problem with that is that the talking anymore means that they have to be the other person, a little bit willing to engage new data and actually, attack it, circle it, think about it, and discern for themselves whether that new data can be incorporated harmoniously with their own data that they have brought to the table as well, or if it's so polar that it means they then have to choose a side in the battle. And I think the truth is like adding like more yarn to the ball. You have to layer it on and layer it on and layer it on instead of like pulling things apart. And I think the problem is that people just don't want to engage any more new data other than what's been professionally brought to them. Look at it this way. Listening to doctors who are experts on a podcast on YouTube comes off as sort of like the poor man's solution to knowledge. Like, it's just, you can get on YouTube as long as you have an internet connection, it's free.
Right.
But when you pay your $100 Rogers bill every month for your fancy television, and that's where your biggest bill goes towards, and now you have all these television channels and these experts weighing the data that they're giving you versus somebody you listen to on your laptop, just by definition, people are going to, I think, gravitate to that, which is the larger industry, because they're going to see validity in that industry.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, they're on TV.
They're on TV. I pay $200 a month for my bill. This has to be the doctors that I listen to,
right,
as opposed to the one I saw on my cell phone for 15 seconds.
Right.
Right. So the problem is that I think a lot of people just don't want to engage any extraneous new doctors that they are not represented on the platform in which they're already going. If those doctors were on that platform, they may very well engage with the information you're talking about. But I think it's the definition of the platform. In the States, it's so polarized. If a doctor shows up on Fox, nobody listening to CNN will ever listen to them.
Right.
Even though it's on TV. So that's something that's already on the same sort of, at least it's on the television. Imagine when you break it down a few levels more and go into podcasts and whatnot.
I would even go a step further, and I think that it's more that it's become so easy for media to put forth a narrative and to keep it on point that it seems it's just the amount of work that the average person would have to put in to overcome that and then find out the real answer. Like these podcasts are like 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Like, I mean, you really have to be invested. Like that's just one story. And if it, and if it has contradictory information, it's like, oh, like now I have to go back and like actually look at this article and like, I don't have the time for this.
In the era of convenience, it's very inconvenient.
It is. And I think that's a big part of the problem is like, and the media makes it easy for you. It's like, don't even bother with that. That's crazy. Like you're not an anti-vaxxer. Like look at the experts we have.
Or I do find sometimes there's this sort of and you might find this on regular legacy media as well. Well, these are what our experts present and this is why we think it's the right thing to do. And then they will show the worst of the offenders from the opposing point of view.
Right.
5G, microchips in your arms, flat earthers.
Right.
And you turn for a second and you engage that data and go, oh my Lord, that's horrific. And then the head directly turns back to the shadows on the wall and says, this is my master, this is my truth. Not realizing that there may be a third, fourth, fifth, 100th path to take.
Right.
They present for a very brief second the worst of the other side, because they know you're going to be, as a human, a little bit curious. They'll present you the worst only to guide you back to the well-padded, secure cell in which they prepared for you.
So question. Why would the media have this agenda? We talk about the they again. So like, is it like, why would the media want to promote this?
Is the media independent?
Okay, let's say, so for example, because you could say, well, the CBC, or look at CNN. They're or at least, I mean, I don't know who their parent company is or whatever, but like they're ostensibly independent. So why wouldn't it even be in their benefit to have two opposing things to?
I think there's two reasons. I don't know how independent they are. If you dig deeper into which are the parent companies that own them, and if those parent companies have any ties to pharmaceutical companies, that would be interesting. I have seen things, but I don't want to just say something I'm not 100% certain about. And then you have to look at their advertising dollars and where do they actually come from. And I do believe there, in the States particular, there is a lot of advertising dollars that come in from big pharma. And so that's one of the two components. The other component is that if you are CNN or Fox, due to this very partisan, polar opposite approach to just life in the States, red states, blue states, it's just one or two options. That's all you have. They're going to play to their base. So they're going to simply provide information in which they know their core viewers are tuning in for. So as opposed to giving you a little bit of everything, even 80-20, because we know most of our viewers want to hear the 80, they're going to give 100% to the 80%. Right. And then the 20, like, we'll see you later, go somewhere else. So the only solution is you have to listen to a lot of resources, podcasts, different news channels, and put in a lot of time. The number of people that put down Joe Rogan all the time, but have never actually spent, 5 minutes listening to him is, people that I anyone who's actually spent time listening to him usually has at least a sympathetic ear towards what he's doing.
Right.
Yeah. And those who don't are people who have never put any time into him whatsoever.
Yeah. The people castigating him as, he's ridiculed only by people who have never listened to him.
People just see the shiny head, the muscles.
Yeah.
He likes to eat elk, and he does UFC, and he's on Fear Factor making people eat spiders.
There's a UFO fetish. You're right.
Yeah, I'm not listening to that Joe Rogan. They literally have him a couple steps away from Alex Jones.
Right.
Which he's had on the show multiple times. So then they chuck him into that category, and then they talk about horse dewormer and this and that. And they're done. Yeah, they do not put any more time into that.
Yeah, and it's crazy that they don't listen to us because I really believe that I've watched probably about 5% maybe of his podcasts over the years, but it's like maybe not even that high. But like you really get the sense when he's having a conversation, he's looking for the truth. He's asking questions. He's listening to the people. There's no agenda. There's no he really seems to be somebody, and I think this is why he's so attractive to so many people, is he seemed to be almost like an everyman looking for the truth, which is what, we are all on some level. That's us.
Well, and the beautiful thing about the 3-hour format, which he's one of the pioneers of, is that as humans, we evolved to be sitting around the campfire, talking for 3-4 hours,
Yeah,
trying to get along with those around the campfire, and there's lots of space for yeah, I see what you now okay. Instead of these short little micro bites you get in 4-minute segments on CNN or Fox or whatever.
Yeah, I think we're thirsty for that as a culture. We need, like, I feel nourished when I listen to some of these long.
Most people do.
Podcasts. Yeah,
and it's just that it's time consuming, and we live in a very busy world, and people just don't have the energy to put into that. To, like you said, you're a big fan of Joe Rogan's podcast, but you only ever really got around to 5% of them.
Yeah.
So then
the
imagine
guy
those
pumps
who
out one every other day. It's like,
it's a big body of work actually. And for me, I just think also, like, I think of like little Greek taverns where old men would meet at 10 o'clock in the morning and sit till lunchtime, 1:32, drinking their ouzo and reiki and stuff from the first thing in the morning, and just having these very opinionered, but no one ever left the cafe because they didn't like what the opinion of someone else. They would sit there and just debate one another. Mm-hmm. There's a very tribal, societal, natural, evolutionary process that unfolds there that you get from a 3-hour podcast that we do not get from a 45-minute news segment.
Yeah.
And the 45-minute news segment really kind of terrifies me because it's punchy, it's short. The duration of time means it has to be hyper-focused. Just like tweets can only allow you to be so nuanced in your response. Mm-hmm. It actually, I think it might actually even like reformat our brains to pick a side with little information very quickly and then move on.
Yeah.
We see it with children using iPads at the age of 2 now before they know how to pick up a pencil.
Right.
So I think we've all been formatted to just absorb information in that way now. And it's not doing us any service.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Okay, well, I think we should just wrap this up. I'm sure we'll have another show on the pandemic of I hope that this one in some way explain to people listening, why we made some of the choices we made, and not even saying that they're right. And one of the big problems I always had was people would. I was never certain about anything. I never proclaimed any sort of truth with authority because I don't know, and I don't think anybody does. So it's kind of.
I hope to be wrong about all of this.
Yeah,
I have
exactly.
No dog in the game. I'm just watching what unfolds. And I'm curious, and people who just assume they're right away. Like I don't care to be right about any of this. I would love to just trust the narrative and move with it. It'd be so much easier.
Well, you could just do so many other things that you want to do in life instead of having to defend your principles,
And I've put a lot of hours in the last 2 years into this, and it's changed the way I view the world on multiple levels. I'd almost call it a pandemic of modernity or something, because it goes well beyond the mandates that we're living today, and we need to. That's as to your point, we'll be talking more about all these things because the underlying issue here is how have we created society? How have we structured how we find information, absorb information, and deal with any new information, and how that affects the way in which we interact with each other in a civil society, right down to within families. You literally have families who don't want to sit at the dinner table anymore with each other based on different misinformation, malinformation, whatnot.
Yeah. Yep. Well said. And I think we'll leave it there. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.